Hello, everyone. Good evening. That is a great welcome. It's wonderful to see so many of you here. I can't think where else you'd be, given, of course, this company, given the opportunity for this event this evening. I'm delighted to welcome you on behalf of the How To Academy. My name's Hannah McInnes, and it's really a privilege to be hosting this particular event, to have this chance to hear about an extraordinary, unique story that captivated the world for years, and firsthand from the person at the centre of it, although we'll hear quite often she had no idea she was at the centre of it.
Right.
The story is one that is written about grippingly in the book that has inspired this event. Many of you may have it already. I'm sure you'll be getting it on the way out if you haven't. Readme.text. I don't think the author of it needs much introduction, I'm sure not to you, as a very enthusiastic, as you showed, audience. She is, of course, an American transparency activist, a politician, a former US Army intelligence analyst, and now works as a security consultant and expert in data science and machine learning. She's also written for The Guardian and The New York Times. And I think this is your first book, isn't it?
This is my first full book, yes.
Your first full book.
I have contributed to a couple other books. Captive Genders, I was a contributing writer, and I think there was one other compilation that I've contributed portions of a book to, and also I have read through books by other people and given my thoughts and insights and things.
Actually, I loved reading in your book about how many thousands of books you read. But we will come to that.
Well, roughly over 1,000.
Over 1,000.
In prison.
We've jumped ahead of ourselves.
Right.
It's so wonderful to have you here. And I wonder if you could start by telling us why you decided you wanted to write this book, why you wanted to tell your story.
So the genesis of this book is actually comes from around the end of 2014. So I had finally settled down into prison, the general population for a while. So this is a year and a half after the court-martial. And I had, just enough time in the library, and things had just settled down enough to where I could creatively write and be able to sort of do things in the library. So we had these computers where we could type something in Word or something like that, and then we weren't able to save anything, but we were able to print something. And so if you wanted to type something up, you'd have to retype the entire document to make a change or something like that, because you weren't able to edit a file or anything like that. So I started writing basically the first draft, the manuscript of my life story, because one of the concerns that I had was that, I had a lengthy sentence ahead of me. From my perspective, I was concerned about, over the next 30 or so years that I'm in prison for, I'll start to lose some of the memory of my youth and my time up to being incarcerated or being while I was in Iraq itself, and I wanted to make sure that I had that down for whenever I did write a memoir much later. Obviously, things changed and things transpired. And by 2017, the commutation happened. Where President Obama commuted my sentence from 35 years to time served plus 120 days or 119 days or something like that. And so by that time, I had basically had this pretty lengthy manuscript of up to around 2010. And so we pitched this as a book, and this book is now is now a pared down version of that with the addition of I went and I included the sort of period of time while I was incarcerated all the way up to the commutation, and so the main purpose of writing this book was to tell my story, because I feel like there's so many big personalities and so many big events and things like that, but it's really, for me personally, this is just such a small snapshot of my time that people are very hyper-focused on. I had, from my perspective, my childhood and my upbringing and sort of how the world around me has been sort of changed around me over time, and how I've been shaped by my environment and how I grew up, and how living through prison and living through the military, being a houseless person, being sort of queer and trans, have really shaped who I am, and all of these different experiences have really shaped me and made me the person I am today. And I'm also only 34 years old, so I don't view this as like a memoir. I was very hesitant to write a memoir, so I view this more as like because I'm more into like young adult books. So I wanted to tell a story that was really a coming of age story, because that's how I feel about my own sort of upbringing for who I am today, and all of the challenges and all of the things that I've yet to accomplish that will be in an eventual, like, hopefully another memoir at some point.
In a few years from now.
A lot more than that, I hope.
So I mean, all of those things that you've spoken about
Right.
there, your upbringing, all of those parts that you bring in that shaped you. I want to sort of get through as much of that as we can.
Right.
But you begin with this brilliant scene
Right.
in Barnes and Noble, and I wonder if you could set the scene as you do for the audience. And
Well,
you're
sure.
in Maryland in Barnes and Noble, and the contrast
And
between
I want to just add, like that, like when I wrote this book, it was chronological. So like this was like we moved, with the publisher and the editor, we made an editorial decision to sort of put this at the beginning to sort of set the stage. But.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it does it so brilliantly. It kind of
Okay.
grabs the reader in, as you will see if you haven't read it yet. And I'd love you to do the same thing now. This kind of this unbelievable contrast between the terrible internet and your surroundings and what you're doing there.
Right. So I'm. It was a very long process to get to this point where essentially I was on leave from Iraq. I had this idea of, I wanted to release, what I entitled the book after, which is readme.txt, which is a file that basically describes these repositories, these two, the Sydney A and Sydney I repositories, which are the, now known as the Iraq war logs and the Afghan war logs. Not my titles, but that's what stuck. And it really is an encapsulation and a description of the true face of 21st century asymmetric warfare, which is a fancy way of saying being a sort of an occupying power, dealing with an insurgency, and how messy and ugly. And because at the time by around 2010, it was the second year of the Obama administration, and despite the years prior, there still being like the continuation of the war on terror from the Bush administration. It kind of lost its like appeal in terms of like its discussion in the broader media and landscape back at home, and I wanted to draw attention to this, and so like I tried to reach out to the New York Times, or first I went to the Washington Post because I'm an avid reader of the Washington Post at this time, and tried to reach out to a reporter. And then there was like a blizzard that happened. So one of the worst blizzards to hit the DC area had hit while I was on leave. There was no electricity. We had no internet. And I had essentially brought these files on an SD card that I had in my possession. And so running out of time and running out of options, and after making an attempt to make contact with the Washington, I made contact with the Washington Post, but we had some difficulty in terms of like understanding what we were discussing, because I didn't want to discuss things over the phone. I didn't want to write it in an email. I wanted to use encrypted communications, but they're like, well, can't you just put it in an email? And I'm like, no. And by this time, I basically had 2 days left before leave, and so then I rented out a car. I finally managed to get a car rental, dug out this car from this mound of snow, dug it out, not with my bare hands or anything. I had the gloves, but like I didn't have like a shovel or anything. And finally got this car running, and I found a bookstore that I frequented quite often, and it had a Starbucks attached to it, and I knew that it had Wi-Fi. So I tried to use the Wi-Fi internet to try to upload this information, and again, like I have one day left. The next day I'm off to Reagan National Airport to fly to Atlanta and go back to Iraq. And with almost no time at all, I make a sort of desperate attempt to upload this stuff in the last minute, and it almost didn't happen because the Wi-Fi, there was problems with the Wi-Fi. It wasn't very stable, and I'm sitting there drinking coffee and listening to music as I'm trying to do this upload. And the way it was done, like if it was, there was no partial, right? So it was encrypted in such a way that like you would need the complete file, because I didn't want a partial, and so I finally got this thing uploaded. But there was a moment there where I was just like, you know what, this is just not meant to be. It's just not. This isn't working out, and I don't have any time left, and I'm running out of options. So I was, I sort of made the decision then and there that if I didn't get it done then I was just going to abandon this process and never return to it again.
So we'll let that, as the book does, kind of
right.
And then you return, as you've mentioned, to your upbringing. And you talk very movingly about your childhood. You grew up with a mother who was from Wales, but
right.
who had a real problem with alcohol. Your father, you say, beat the crap out of you.
Yeah.
Why was that important to sort of go back, explore that, and the impact it had on you going forward?
Sure. Yeah. I didn't realize just how because I was an upper middle class like person growing up in central Oklahoma. Sort of very rural sort of lifestyle, but we were fairly well off. I had a computer, I had a laptop, even as a fairly young child in the 1990s. But despite this, there was a lot of sort of instability within the family. Although I didn't really understand that that my life was different than other people's lives at this point, so I didn't really know that there was anything different. But yeah, like I had this sort of fraught relationship with my father, where it was essentially he was just constantly mad at me, I just wanted him to really open up, or I just wanted him to appreciate me and to tell me that he loved me, the only thing that seemed to really catch his attention or do anything was to be good academically. So I really focused on that, and also we had a sort of mutual interest in computers, and so he helped me learn how to do some of the early programming. I didn't understand it at first, but by the time I was like 7 or 8, I started to grasp sort of the basic concepts of what he was trying to teach me. But yeah, I feel like all of this is just sort of what shapes my background, and and as a part of my life story, and then obviously my sister plays more and more of a pivotal role in terms of being sort of a third parent in my life. And in terms of like my mother attempting suicide, my father, sort of not being available, and so my mother my sister eventually, just played more and more of a role, and I also just like really admired my sister. She was just a tremendous source of energy and support and love that I had at this time.
Yeah, that really comes through, and she's a very strong character at that time, and swirling around with all of this is what you call a toothache that never goes away.
Right.
Which is just sort of the feeling of your gender dysphoria. Right. So that was there from as long back as.
Well, I mean, I didn't know what it was, right? It's just this, gender, what's what I now know is called gender dysphoria, which is like the sort of not knowing, sort of like, because like I always knew I was different, right? Everybody around me knew I was different. Everybody was telling me constantly. I was getting this constant negative feedback from people growing up, that I was like, extremely effeminate, that I was different, that it was just something, something was different about me, and so I. So I always just felt sort of different and receiving all this sort of different energy from people and feeling really out of place or out of step with things. It wasn't until my late teens through the internet that I sort of started to understand this thing, because like the way that I understood trans people from mass media of the 90s at least was always viewed through like this lens of like, oh, it's the victim prostitute in Law and Order or something like that. Like that was my only really understanding of this kind of thing. So it wasn't until the communities started to grow and information started to seep through that I was really able to understand this. But yeah, like I went through years of sort of experimenting with sort of my gender presentation, and who I am, and just trying to figure this stuff out. And it was very, very difficult in that era, because like the average person didn't know what a trans person was in the 90s.
And you say in Oklahoma, gender roles were as fixed as the land. So there was
exactly. And this was even the case like in comparison, because I went to secondary school here in the UK, in Southwest Wales, and the gender roles in Oklahoma, like it was to the point where, if you were at a school dance in middle school, it was just there was no commingling of the genders, right? It was just like boys on one side, girls on the other side, nothing in between. But by the time I got to the UK, it was like sort of like co-ed and people commingling all here and there, and it wasn't used to that at first.
Yeah, it's interesting. So, I mean, people might not know that you had this quite a lot of the time growing up you spent in Wales.
Right.
But you were obviously quite keen to get back to the States.
Well, I never really assimilated, right? Because like I never really, I had an American accent. My mother, brought me back after gaining custody of me after a pretty rough divorce between my parents in the year 2000, and I started going to school in the UK, and it was like a culture shock from moving from one country to the other. Even though I visited quite frequently, I'd traveled all over Europe and the UK by this point, but my family. Going through this sort of split, which was a very significant split. I mean, I was away from my sister. I was with my mother, who became increasingly dependent on alcohol, and then I would go to school and just sort of have to make new friends, navigate a new culture, and also like it was the first time that I really. Because I was like 13 years old, right? And I'm encountering, students who see all this stuff on the news about like the war on terror, and people are blaming me for like the American about talking to me and blaming me for American foreign policy, and I'm like, I'm 13, I have nothing to do with any of that. I don't even know what's going on, and but yeah, I never really I did make friends, and I'm still friends with them to this day, of course, but. I never really fully assimilated into the UK, and it never felt like home. I never really felt like I was at home. Even though I did at one point consider like going to University of Bristol or Cardiff at various points. I think Birmingham University for engineering at one point as well. But yeah, by the time my mother had a couple strokes at the age of her mid-50s, I knew that I was essentially going to be stuck in Southwest Wales, trying to take care of a potentially disabled mother, and really kind of being stuck. And I wanted to do more, and so I reached out to my sister. My sister pushed me off to my father, and I returned back to the, around end of 2005, and I had finished secondary school at this point. So I moved back in with my father, and by this time he had remarried. He had he had another child, or like he had married into having other children from a previous marriage, and I didn't really fit in, and and eventually his new wife and I butt heads constantly, especially because I was like a gender non-conforming person. So so eventually I got kicked out of my house. I got kicked out of my dad's house, and I borrowed my father's truck. I took it and headed out. And first I stayed with my sister. Then I went out to Tulsa, Oklahoma. I tried to stay. I tried to stay at whenever I was living in Oklahoma, my best friend's house, which lasted for about a week before I was like, okay, like this whole staying with my best friend is not going to work out. Sneaking into his house or whatever, and I drove out to the city of St. Louis. Got there, and I was like, okay, I've got enough gas money, like, let's see how much further I can go. And I saw the sign for Chicago, so I drove out to Chicago, Illinois, and that was where I settled for the next few months, was the city of Chicago.
You then, fast forward a bit of time, you decide, you live with your aunt for a while, and then you decide to go and join the military.
Right.
And I think, you write about the very many sort
I
of
worked
reasons.
at Starbucks as well. That was,
I miss out Starbucks, of course.
Went to I started taking university courses, but like it was limited because like I was working while also trying to do it through like adult school programs. It was a very complicated arrangement to try to finish getting my degree, because I was shooting for a physics degree.
But the reason, the many reasons I think that you chose, because people, might have felt surprised in the sense that you then, with all those things you talk about, the engineering, you chose the military, but...
I don't know why. I mean, this is precisely the reasons why most people join the military.
Yeah, it feels like it was a sort of sense of belonging you were seeking there, and
right.
also trying to...
Yeah, I did. I had no idea what was the point of doing anything. Like, I was working 2 jobs. It wasn't enough to pay for anything. I was paying for tuition because in the U.S. you pay quite heavily for tuition, which is increasingly the case here. But in the U.S. in particular at this time, it was exorbitant. I was trying to figure out, like, what am I doing? Like, what is it that I'm doing? Like, I'm working an enormous amount of time. I was either in class, working at Starbucks, working at some other odd job, and maybe getting sleep in there and somewhere in there. I was working or studying for 100 to 110 hours a week, which was extremely unsustainable. And I started to break down, and I was wondering, like, what do I do? Like what can I do? And also, like, I'm just sort of like, oh my goodness, like, it was the first realization, like, maybe I'm trans. Maybe, I finally knew that, sort of trans people existed, that you could get hormones, and that was an option. But it would seem like an expensive option because it wasn't covered by health insurance in that era, like it is now in the States. And I was just like, what am I doing? What's the point of anything? Where do I go? Everything costs enormous amounts of money. I don't know how to make enormous amounts of money. And I want to rekindle the relationship with my father. I finally got back in touch with him, and he was very insistent. You should enlist in the Navy, and because he was very proud of his time in the Navy, and very, very heavily influenced by it. He's like, he'll give you structure, and also like the Iraq War was really starting to come off at this point. So this is the time of the troop surge. It was like in my aunt's household, this was a dinner table conversation, right? It was on the evening news every night. There was the household names of like Robert Gates, of Donald Rumsfeld, of sort of the endless discussions about the troop surge in Iraq, whether we have enough, whether there's enough boots on the ground, whether we continue to be there or not. And then there's also the recruiting effort that's ongoing. So like the military was recruiting very heavily, and they were offering these very hefty bonuses. And so my father insisted on me enlisting in the Navy, and I was like, you know what, like I'm being still kind of rebellious. I was just like, oh, well, I guess I'll enlist in the Marine Corps. And so I went over to the Marine Corps recruiting center, and they weren't there that day. Their recruiting depot was closed, but right across the hall from that was the U.S. Army recruiting center, and I popped in there expecting I was hoping to maybe get like a brochure or something, and so I popped my head in, and I kind of, it's funny because like I kind of had this because like I was about 105 pounds, was pretty small, like 5'2", and so I poked my head in thinking like, oh, they'll laugh at me, and then it was just like these 3 recruiters just all turned their heads looking at me like I was fresh meat, and yeah, they all and then they sort of jumped on it, and I was just like, do y'all have a brochure? And they're like, come sit down.
Yeah, when you write about this, it's extraordinary how unbelievably keen. They won't let you go. I mean, everything that could have stopped you,
right.
they're just very, very keen that you join. I think the only
they're very insistent, yes.
Yeah, and you say it was a sort of a sense of sort of belonging and pleasing your father again that really kind of drove this.
And he showed up to my graduation. Both the graduation from basic training and to the graduation from my intelligence school training, and yeah, he was very proud. He was very excited. He was just like, oh yeah, he showed up. Him showing up to something and traveling to go see me meant a lot to me.
So if we forward to when you get to Iraq in the end. When you were first there, perhaps you could explain what it was you were doing and why at the beginning you didn't have time to process this surveillance on a philosophical level. You had this extraordinary access to people's lives, but it was so busy at the beginning, you didn't have those thoughts.
We're skipping some parts because like I was in the States for about a year before this. So after initial training, then I hit, I sort of reached Fort Drum, New York, and I'm at my unit, and we're on the Homeland Security mission, right? Which we're bordering Canada, so not exactly the most exciting work at this time. But we were also doing pre-deployment work for where we were originally slated to go to Afghanistan. December 2009. So my job and my role essentially was to keep up with what the current unit that was deployed to the Logar and Wardak provinces of Afghanistan, and really pay attention to like what that unit was doing, what the intelligence reporting was doing, and then bring this up, and produce a kind of an intelligence pre-deployment, package, if you will. And this took several months to develop and build and maintain, and this really became my job, which was completely thrown out in April of 2009. Like I had done this job for about 7 or 8 months at this point, and we had still about another 5 or 6 months to go before our December deployment, and then we got bumped up to an earlier slot. We had to completely redo everything for an earlier slot, and then we were going to, by the way, we're completely changing our theater of operations to Iraq instead, which, made sense from the perspective of other people who had previously deployed, because like our unit, 2nd Brigade Combat Team, had deployed 4 times to this region already. It was actually at the time in 2009, it was the most deployed, and also the most had received the most amount of casualties of any U.S. Army mainline unit, like as opposed to like a special operations unit, just a standard infantry brigade. So there was just sort of the sense of like, oh God, no, not again, from some of the people who had deployed a few times, and I was I was frustrated with the fact that my sort of package had been thrown out, and then we were building a new one, but I was also excited because, you know, I was like, finally, I've done all this training, I'm ready to do my job, I'm actually kind of good at this, I'm getting a lot of good feedback from the officers, and so I, I work on the Iraq pre-deployment package, and you know, it's exciting work, and I was really looking forward to it. You know, I was like, okay, but then there was the older people and the people who had deployed to, you know, to Iraq previously, mostly on at least one deployment, but you know, some even 2-3 times previously, and who were just like, you don't know what you're talking about. I wouldn't be excited at all. This like pessimistic jadedness and like this wariness around it, and I was just like, oh gosh, what is this? So I finally deploy in October of 2009, and and I'm excited. I'm like, hit the ground running. But it became very clear that sort of even as an intelligence analyst, you know, being sort of getting this sort of packaged information previously, how there was this vast discrepancy between, you know, what I because I consider myself a fairly informed and educated, you know, person. I wasn't necessarily very political, but I did consider myself well informed, and I got the sense that what we were actually doing and what the on the ground reality was so vastly different than what the average person was, and I was warned about this by my colleagues who had deployed previously.
Because there's a moment where you just start to sort of identify that what you feel the military are in fact agents of destruction. You call them.
It's a bit more complex than that. So I think that the way this works is because, like, you know, I work in data science, and you know, I can't really get into the nuts and bolts of what my job was as an analyst, but like ultimately my job was to take an enormous amount of information from various data sets from across the board, far more information than, you know, was even touched in the sort of disclosures or whatever, you know, certainly much more sensitive sources of information, and build a model using, we had a room full of servers of like 2007 to 2009 era, you know, Dell blades, and we essentially had to do build these artificial intelligence, what we would now know as artificial intelligence and machine learning training models, and try to produce predictive analysis as to sort of a weather report. You know, the equivalent of sort of whenever you're looking at, I know that y'all don't really see them very often because you mostly get just temperatures of whether it's raining, but you know, in the U.S. you'll see that there's like sort of radar images and like the expectation of extreme storms and hurricanes and things like that. So we're building this weather model pattern for what's going to happen in terms of how the war plays out over the, you know, where the potential hotspots are going to be based on all of these different sources of information. And you know, I'm sort of feeding and training and honing in these algorithms with this, you know, we had to chunk the data, so because you know, we just only had so much computational power. But one of the things that I started to realize was there were these feedback loops, right? So we weren't just able to, because all of the different feeds of information, you know, were transparent, right? This wasn't just like enemy activity. This wasn't just civilian activity. This wasn't just like our activity. Like, it was just all mushed in together, although you could untangle them. And you could see that, you know, whenever there was a hotspot of activity and we responded to it, there would be a response to the response, and then our response, and there's escalation, a sort of echo effect. And it became very clear that our behavior in response to these things was also predictable. And so there were these feedback loops that were happening, continuing, and you could see this pan out through the model. It was even these fairly early these early modeling methods, and it became very clear that, you know, and I even brought this up with my officers once. I was like, sir, like, you won't believe this, but I'm fairly certain that our response to this activity will be this, based on the model and our previous behavior and all these different other sources, and this is based on what the computer is saying, and and it was this sort of almost deliberate misunderstanding of it, like where it was just like, oh, so the computer agrees with me then, and it's just like, no, like that's not what we're getting at here, sir. And so so there was it was very clear that this was just a continuing issue, and it was like an unresolvable thing, and it was just such a and yeah, like while I'm doing this, I'm just sort of like, okay, like this is a treadmill, like we're just sort of doing the same thing, and all the other people who had deployed previously, and the people who had had come on this deployment with me as well, we were all just sort of like, what are we doing? Like what is our actual mission here? What is the end goal or the end state goal? It just feels like we're here to, and I've been told, many occasions, it's just sort of like, keep your head down, get a pay, take the paycheck, go home, retire, become a contractor, whatever, just like, it just felt very, very jaded and very, sort of bleak.
I mean, what you're saying and what you're questioning and what you question is the idea that the war's built on these unreliable boundaries you talk about of good and bad, and you don't sort of put your head down. You obviously spend a lot of time in online chat. In online is where you turn to.
Right.
And I wonder if you could tell people about this relationship you formed with. It is WikiLeaks, but at the time...
Well, there's so many other people at this time, though. These are very busy chat rooms.
Very busy chat rooms, but what's interesting is how you talk about the fact that, in a way, your giving of what became the collateral murder tape to WikiLeaks almost was the formation of WikiLeaks as an organization.
I guess, but, it could have been anyone else. It was really a fluke.
So how did it happen that you ended up giving that tape to them, which then sort of built that relationship?
I was like, okay, like here's a big outlet, the Washington Post. That was what I had in my brain. I didn't know about Dan Ellsberg. I didn't know about the Pentagon Papers. I knew about a lot of Vietnam, but I really didn't know about this time period. I knew about the Nixon stuff, like Watergate, because I had seen movies too. And I had this image of like, this sort of handoff, right, where I'm like handing off an SD card in like a parking garage, like a Washington Post reporter or something. And so it was like 1971, but digital, I guess. And so that was what I tried to make happen. And while I've been very technical and I've been in the online space, I've been on IRC chats and I've done sort of political activism inside and outside sort of these online spaces before, this really could have, like the Washington Post reporter, if they had just known a little bit about encryption, or if Signal was available, this would have, it would have drastically changed the outcome of how this happened, And even how the Starbucks internet worked that day was just sort of a fluke.
But so what do you mean when you talk about getting the video out to WikiLeaks?
It's not video. It's like,
turned them, you say, into an actual organisation rather than simply an affinity group. It sort of felt like that moment was sort of formed them as a group.
I guess.
Yeah.
That's what I think.
But that collateral murder tape was one of the tapes, but there was a number of other stuff that ended up getting into the public domain.
Right.
And you were obviously eventually found out. You talk quite...
Well, it was kind of hard to miss.
So how
and I really did. I kind of struggled with this after a while because I was like, because one of my concerns was they can figure out which office this is coming from. So one of my concerns was that I was worried that they would get disentangled with other people like from my office.
Mm. So you talk quite briefly in the book about the how it came to be that they knew it was you, but they come to get you, and there's an extraordinary description of how you initially feel this complete numbness.
Sure.
As you're taken away, and then you end up in Kuwait, and all
Yeah,
your
and that's even more numb because it's like, I'm just sort of in a big steel box and in a tent in Kuwait with no idea what's going on. Nobody's telling me anything. There was like there was two Navy Masters at Arms. They were called MAs, and they just sort of watched me at all times. It was kind of ridiculous.
You say,
I start. There were two heaters, or not heaters, but coolers. There were air conditioners. That one of them worked, one of them didn't work, one of them worked, and then the other one worked. It was just off and on kind of situation in a tent. So it's a dual-walled tent, so you can't see any light from the outside. And just inside this cage, and they're just coming and feeding me, and the lights are on constantly, although it's kind of dim. And yeah, that was like my experience for about 59 days. I had no idea how many days it was because there's no way to keep count, no way to keep track. It's actually one of the blurrier parts of my time period is just sort of being in this empty cage. I remember very distinctly that the one thing I remember is that there was a sign that told you where the cage was made, which was Fort Wayne, Indiana.
You say all your memories of that time are trauma memories, and you then go to Quantico, Virginia, which later was described as cruel, inhuman, and degrading. And
Yeah, but from my perspective, from Kuwait, I viewed it as an upgrade in my state because it was like, oh, it's, like I'm home, like I'm here in the U.S. I was actually told some of the Navy folks actually were screwing around with me, and they're like, oh, we're going to put you in the bottom of the USS Boxer, which was the cruiser ship or something like that. Like I'm bragging on the Boxer, which where they do bad things to people there. And then there was the then some of them were like, you're gonna go to Guantanamo Bay, and like other stuff like that. And you couldn't in my state, you really couldn't tell if they were joking or if they were serious or anything like that. But yeah, eventually I was taken to Quantico. And the MAs delivered me to the Marine Corps, and I was like, oh, wow, like there's hot and cold food, there's air conditioning that's stable, it's a building with hot and cold running water, it's well lit. Like initially, like there was this like sense of like, this is an upgrade, like, and then I actually got to see my family. It was behind 2 inches of whatever material this plexiglass was as a partition. But I got to see my family. It was the first time that I got to see my family, and then actually start to talk to a lawyer and realize sort of the charges and navigate through sort of the defense process.
I said at the start in my introduction that you were you were sort of almost the last person to know often about the storm that you were the center of. When did you and how did you come to know what you'd set in motion, what the outside world was making of all of this?
Sure. Gunnery Sergeant Blennis, that was his name. He sat me down after I arrived at Quantico, and he says, "You're famous, aren't you? You're on Fox News all the time." And I was like, "I am?" And he's like, "Yeah." And that was how I found out.
What did you make of that?
Well, I hadn't even had the charges explained to me at that point. So, he's casually telling me about, what's happened in the last 59 days. I have no idea. And I'm just sort of like, yes, Gunnery Sergeant.
You quote Obama and Hillary Clinton in the book. You say Hillary Clinton said of what you'd done, puts people's lives at danger, threatens our national security, and undermines our efforts to work with other countries to solve shared problems. Obama later said, I can't conduct diplomacy on open source. You said you thought he was really pissed off.
Not personally, but certainly the office and the office. The White House was
and
was
we'll come to him again. Do you, with either of those comments, have any understanding of what they said or sympathy with their worries?
Sure. I mean, they're of course they're mad. It's like the U.S. government. This time in this context is the United States and many other large states and state actors and institutions are really coming to grips with the reality of sort of the information-driven age, where information, like today, flows much more freely, right? We're in, like people often, say, well, this is rapid, this is radical transparency. It's like, well, by today's standards, we live in radical transparency. Like almost everything gets out almost immediately, right? But this is the first time that these sort of institutions have sort of come across this idea of like, perhaps, sort of like information, we can't really do anything anymore because it ends up, on Twitter or on Facebook or, whatever social media, sites are popular in 2010. So yeah, this is the first time, and then it progressed throughout the rest of the early to mid 2010s, this wrangling of large, seemingly impenetrable institutions just sort of dealing with the fact that widespread internet access and widespread spread of information is now the norm.
What about, obviously I quote Hillary Clinton here, but lots of people, and the reason you were put in prison for so long was the charge that you had put people's lives in danger, that you'd threatened national security.
My job was to kill people. Put people's lives in danger all the time. It's life and death issues are a pretty common issue whenever you're dealing in the national security space. So, it's just another decision among so many other. But I do think that. I think that, in the end, as we were going through the court-martial process, I think that it says a lot about sort of the way that the government viewed this stuff is that they instead of mentioning actual harm, they would remove any sort of language about like causing harm or causing damage as to could have, or hypotheticals, which are very difficult to prove in a court, right? It's very difficult to like counter somebody saying this could have happened, right? Which is a frustrating sort of process to go through, but my lawyers did a fantastic job of sort of addressing these things.
Yeah, the could have keeps coming up, where they try very, very hard
right.
to make you agree that you aided the enemy. This keeps coming up, and you are absolutely
that was a
adamant.
bizarre charge. You have to understand, and this is important for me especially, because this had never happened before. Nobody had ever gone to pretrial confinement or to prison or been held in these kinds of conditions. Nobody, the previous person that I was aware of, which was Thomas Drake, was out on bail. He had never gone to jail. He had been arrested briefly, but released same day. After being accused of an unauthorized disclosure. Dan Ellsberg had never gone to prison. I didn't know about his case, but Dan Ellsberg had never gone to jail for the Pentagon Papers. He was accused and he had a court-martial, but he was, or not a court-martial, but a federal trial. He was brought before a federal court, but he was out on bail. He was out and about, and so no, this has never happened before. Nobody had ever gone to jail before for this. I was the first person to go to jail for an unauthorized disclosure to the press, right? So, there was no precedent. This had never happened before. The expectation, the understanding that everybody seems to have now is very strange to me, because this had never happened before, right? And so everybody is like, oh, well, you should, did you think you were going to prison? And I was like, well, no, it had never come up before.
Yeah,
there was no examples.
And you say that just wasn't something you had thought would
happen.
happen.
I thought, I'll face getting potentially discharged or losing my security clearance. These were a big deal. To a junior intelligence analyst at the age of 22, having a security clearance, having a SCI security clearance, that was a big deal. That was a career ender. Losing that thing meant, essentially a complete life path change. Out the door and, out back to Starbucks, right? So that was very grave and very serious to me. and I took that very seriously. But that was the range of potential consequences that were really understood at that time in 2010.
And where you ended up was incredible. I mean,
I think that the overreaction just speaks to how far this, these institutions had gone off the rails.
When you, one of the really important things about writing in detail of the trial is you say it's important that people understood the nuance of what you did, and many people thought it was about peace. But for you, there were two things that were really important looking back. That you were a transparency advocate above all. It wasn't necessarily, and also people have said, and even your legal team argued that it was influenced that by your gender dysphoria, that pushed you to breaking points.
Yeah, that's a separate issue. And I find it frustrating whenever people talk about identity, like of who the person is, because like the government always wants to dig into who you are, right?
But you were very keen to say
because what if I was an African American male, right? Like if I had that background, it would have been all about that, right? It's always the identity of the person, not what the authenticity or the meaning of the action, right?
Yeah, so it was very important to you writing the book to say, I mean, you say the strategy that they used about the idea.
Yeah, nuts and sluts, as they call it.
What are your words? You say that it kind of continues even now to weigh on you, that strategy and the idea if there was any causal relationship between...
Oh yeah, the sort of defense strategy. Well, it was either that or we had no case whatsoever, right? We had no, because like the way the military structured this, and the way that the federal courts had sort of limited these cases, and have continued to limit these cases, is there are three potential defense approaches in a court-martial that I had available to me. The first was that I could argue that I didn't do it, which was not available because it was pretty clear that and I wasn't even trying to try to argue that it was somebody else, right, or that this didn't happen, because it clearly happened and it was pretty clear that and I wanted to take responsibility for it. The second thing is that you were incapacitated in some way. It's the sort of the equivalent of like the insanity defense, but it's a little broader in that like you could be incapacitated from a health reason. You could have been unconscious. You could have been on an extraordinary amount of substances that weren't somebody drugged you or something like that. That wasn't available because I was awake. I was there. I was fairly stable. I was sober. And the third option was a mitigation strategy, which is what we had to take, which is basically taking every single aspect of every single bit of life and then exaggerating it to a point, to where, you can argue, well, extenuating circumstances, mean that this should be treated with more leniency, or that there's more to the story here. So it's about extenuating and mitigating circumstances. And that was the only strategy that we had. Otherwise, it would have just been the prosecution arguing stuff and then us sitting there and going, we rest our case. Because there's no public interest defense for this. There's no arguing that, this is, we were barred, we were explicitly barred throughout the process, and it's normal practice under U.S. law for unauthorized disclosure cases involving national security information that no defense, no public interest defense be raised. It's either classified at the time of its release, and it was released, or it wasn't, and that's it. Like that's all that you can raise.
While you're going through this process, Edward Snowden and the news about his leaks comes out, and you say while you support Ed Snowden, the timing was difficult. It was just frustrating. Was difficult for you. Yeah. I wonder if you could explain that, how it's influenced.
It was, that wasn't intentional, right? Like I'm not saying that, but like it was a third day of trial, so the reporters. The courtroom was packed every day at this point. It was like a few weeks of pretrial. Of like pretrial hearings, and then we get right into the court-martial, and then the Ed Snowden leaks happened, and obviously he wasn't out yet. He hadn't identified himself, but as soon as that news broke, like there was just no press there. There was like 3 people there. Went from like 60 people to 3 overnight. So it was frustrating because we were we were really starting to try to put on our case and, put on our defense, and nobody was watching, nobody was recording.
I need to get to the audience questions. I could carry on for probably at least
Yeah,
another
and,
hour, but let me just ask you.
Well, I mean, I do so much other stuff now, it's just like...
So let me ask you exactly, but well, should we move to the now part? But I want to know why you say that in some ways military prison, I think people would be surprised to hear you said in some ways military prison was the only place you felt you ever really fit in.
Well, I mean, say that because I've spent so long in there, but think about this, especially in the context of living in the United States in the 2020s, right? Things have become so politically unstable in the U.S. Things, nothing is really provided for people, and everything feels very uncertain, right? I don't know what tomorrow brings. Whether it's just small scale personal stuff, I don't know what I don't know. Whether I'll have access to health care next month. I don't know whether I'll be able to pay the bills for next month. I don't know if I'll be able to pay rent for next month, that kind of thing, right? That level of uncertainty, things that I'd never really had to deal with in prison because it was just everything was provided for. I had health care, I had housing, I knew where the factions were and who the different groups of people that I had to interact with were on any given day. There was no question about whether I was getting food or not. All of these, with supply chain issues and sort of instability and price fluctuations and all the rest of it within the U.S. I don't even know what government the U.S. is going to, the region of where the U.S. is going to have in 5 years. The amount of instability and the amount of uncertainty that comes from being out and about in the world is quite hits me very hard. I don't feel as secure. I don't in comparison to the way that I did whenever I was in general population in prison. It's different in solitary confinement, but general population in prison, you can sort of have a social life. You can sort of have some stability. You can sort of have, and obviously, living among an inmate population, you sort of have people who have your back, and you sort of know where things stand on any given day, and it's just such a. I don't know where people stand. I don't know who's being truthful. I can't really check on people on where, and people keep changing, and they keep it just feels like the relationships that we have in the outside world are so much more superficial than the ones that exist in prison.
So many more questions. I can't dominate them any more, though, because we've got some time and we've got some microphones and some questions from you. Please, sure. Can I... we have another chance for applause. Can I ask... Can I put in a little request that you make your questions as concise as possible, because I'd love to get through as many as we can, and so just to do that we need to just keep them quick if you could. So if you've got do you want me to? Yes, put your hands in the other. There's one hand up there. Yep. There's a lady here. Quite a lot of, and there's some people on the balcony as well. Good lot of people on the balcony.
Thank you. I have a question about where the personal meets the political. And I've read that you went into the army hoping that it might help you with your own gender and identity issues, and you got bullied and it didn't work. Then you discovered that your country has an identity issue. It's presenting itself in one way and acting in another. Do you feel the personal fueled the political and gave you an arena where you could solve a problem that was much more straightforward than the one you personally had?
Yeah, I feel a bit uncomfortable trying to conflate the two because they're just so different. They're so radically different. And also, just sort of my personal journey has been so different than, the journey of me learning how to navigate sort of the bigger picture and the more abstract things, right? So I don't. Me personally, I hesitate and I don't feel comfortable trying to compare the two because they're just so, and to say that the U.S. is going through an identity crisis is putting it quite mildly. I think that it's, you know, like this has been going on for a very long time, and I think that this, I think, you know, like I was aware of this, certainly, you know, sort of the political landscape of things, but yeah, I think that I think that the discrepancy between what I thought I knew things were versus what the reality was, and then also trying to communicate with people back home about sort of what was going on, really struck me. I mean, I recall significantly, most poignantly, there was this Thomas Friedman piece, you know, while he's kind of mocked now, he's very taken enormously seriously in this time, around 2010. He had written an article which basically was a 180 from like the position of many in the liberal establishment from a few years prior during the Bush administration, which was essentially that, oh, actually now that, you know, Iraq is having elections and now it's peaceful and it's stable, now the Iraq war was justified or whatever. But like the reality was that things were very unstable, things were very precarious, and, you know, the election process was far from a fair one that was occurring. This was just the sort of on the ground reality, and it was very clear that the framing of this was missing a lot of the real world context that is no longer missing, right? People know this now, and it's very difficult to sort of gloss over what, you know, and sort of memory hole this whole time. I do think that, you know, one of the things that isn't really mentioned in the book, but that, you know, was at the forefront of my mind was that one of my jobs and one of my roles was essentially as a data scientist, and to work with these different models was to do comparative models, like look at previous data and compare it and sort of see if we could train the model to do better things, you know, to like do better predictions better, right? And so I was definitely very interested in trying to obtain Vietnam War era data and sort of digitized versions of that. But it turns out that all of the equivalent records of what, you know, is now, I mean, well, the Sydney I and Sydney A, you know, repositories, which is the Iraq and Afghanistan war logs. The Vietnam equivalent was held, I think, in like Missouri. It was held in a gigantic warehouse in Missouri. But there was a freak fire. It was an accident that happened in 1978 when all of his records have been lost to history.
Yeah.
We are so happy to have you here, Chelsea Manning. We love you. And
Okay, can you get to the question?
Yeah, okay. Straight to the question. I would like to ask you, does the government respect your freedom that you have, or they continue intimidating you? And another question. You are a brilliant analyst, and I would like to know, and we would like to know, what will be the best strategy to free Julian Assange? Because from the from the government, they are corrupt. We cannot expect anything.
We've got the two questions. I'm so
Thank
sorry.
you.
We have to be quite quick.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so for the first question, I think that the government, I think that the U.S. government has been, the U.S. government in particular had, you know, while they were it was fairly uncomfortable in the first couple of years. I feel like, and especially with the grand jury subpoena in 2019, I haven't really encountered much of the U.S. government. There's so much happening in the U.S. right now. It's uncertain where things lie, where it feels like the federal government is starting to sort of unravel. The U.S. government is sort of going, and the United States in general is going through a contraction period where it doesn't have the same influence around the world that it used to. It doesn't have the same, and it recognizes this, it understands this. And so I feel like because the military is sort of falling back, and the U.S. influence across the world is falling back, and obviously this is happening with all of the three major powers, were Russia, China, the United States, and a number of regional powers are sort of starting to come up and become more prominent. Not necessarily more powerful, but they become more prominent because of this sort of contraction of influence, and sort of you see these state actors that are sort of grasping at straws to just sort of maintain their regional balance and a regional influence, which is a very different situation than the hegemony that was experienced previously. I think that since January, since obviously the election sort of dispute of 2020 and the January 6th incident in the putsch attempt, really, that happened. The U.S. is just increasingly feeling like it's at a head with itself, and there's a lot of uncertainty. And as for the other question, and there's not really much that I can comment on or say, because look, if you just go to the book, like, one of the problems that I have is that the court-martial record is basically everything that I have in terms of like the secrecy agreement with from my time in the military is covered. So like there's even there's gigantic redactions in this book. There's like entire pages blacked out because it's there we go, you found it. So because
you want to
we
peel it back.
We were surprised. We turned this because and the way this happened is that there were two cases. So there was the Ed Snowden case, which was a civil case in which they seized his proceeds from the book. And then there was a book by John Bolton, a very different book, but it was also, there was also a court proceeding that happened. And so we, through the publisher, made the decision, okay, we're not really covering sensitive stuff here. This is a personal story. This is my life story. I'm not getting into the nitty-gritty of the details. Like, you can find that and you can confirm that or deny that however you want to, what was actually released. But I can't touch that stuff legally under U.S. law. But I'm able to. We made the decision to push the book through the government review process, and they asked us to redact some portions, and we really, they didn't ask us, they told us. So we redacted those portions, even though quite frankly, we were shocked. We wouldn't have turned that stuff over to the government if we thought it was safe, if it contained sensitive information, so we were surprised.
Can I just pick up, you just mentioned this January the 6th putsch, that as you call it.
We're going through some things right now.
How does that make you react to Trump's sort of announcement, I think, was it a day ago, that he's going to stand again, especially given in the light of the stability and the instability you were talking about that you feel in the States at the moment?
The U.S. is...
And the things that he's tried to push through.
Right. The U.S. isn't about... Right now, I know this is harder to explain from outside, because there's not as much international travel has been going on. But the United States is in a situation where it's like, yes, there are figureheads, yes, there are people discussed, and yes, there are all these social media topics. But there is a constant anxiety and a constant low level, like any incident that happens within the United States right now, in some regions especially, it's sort of patchwork quilt. The tinder is so extremely high that it feels like going to the shopping market, people are scared, and people feel like violence could break out, like political violence could break out at any moment. It's that uncomfortable, and Americans, I think, are hesitant to talk about it. Definitely, the press is hesitant to talk about it, but everybody sort of feels this. Like I feel it whenever I'm in Europe. Anytime I'm in Europe, I feel like super calm, right? And I was out. I was in. I'm just like, oh, my anxiety levels are just dramatically lower, right? Just don't feel as. I don't feel like and this has happened where like people people are just very worried. They're very scared. There's not as much. There's not a lot of political. Like I would if I were an intelligence analyst examining a country, any other country in the world, and I looked at the demographics and the numbers and the statistics and the model of the United States, I would say this is a red flag for a major civil conflict. Like this country is very unstable, and there's about to be extreme factional violent extremism violence that happens here in the very near future. And this is what the United States is. I mean, it's not a guarantee that happens, but I mean, it's certainly in a very, very high risk category. And this hasn't dissipated. Like it just seems to be getting punted and punted, yet the indicators and the sort of the warning signs just keep rising and rising. I don't think that this is the end of it. And I don't think it's necessarily because of Donald Trump. I think this predates Donald Trump, the sort of rise. Like obviously Dylan Roof and the shooting of the Charleston, South Carolina church was sort of before the Trump era. Like the sort of extreme polarization that's happening, not just among like political parties, but just among sort of generational differences and differences in class and identity and and access to material resources and wealth is so diverse and so stark and so and there's no ability to have a conversation in America that is really constructive. It feels like every single debate or conversation is one of I'm not going to talk to you anymore. I mean, just there isn't really the Thanksgiving dinner conversation that's just so stereotypical historically in the United States. That's my sense. That's my opinion.
Where's the microphone?
Sorry, that was a long-winded answer.
Is there a microphone upstairs? No, okay.
Yeah, two more.
Thank you, Chelsea, for your service to transparency. I spent 13 months in US prisons for anti-war resistance, and I worked with your mother, Susan, and Uncle Kevin.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, it's coming. Context. In solidarity with you. I'm wondering how aware you were of solidarity on the outside, how significant it was to sustaining you in prison.
I did not understand that question.
How aware you were of solidarity outside when you were inside and how that sustained you? I know you write about the huge amount of...
People sending me letters is very important. And one of the things that I try to do now is I encourage people to write letters to people in prison, regardless of their background, who they are, or anything, because because I got many letters. So I got, I think the final count by the U.S. Army for my time under U.S. Army custody, not including other periods of time in which I was in civilian custody, was, I think, 270,000 pieces of mail. Obviously, I got an extraordinary amount of mail, and that meant that the prison had to hire additional staff to deal with that. But I mean, but seriously, like that doesn't mean that there aren't people who are in jail that are not getting mail, and that one letter will make a lifetime of difference for that person. It's really tremendous how disconnected you are, especially when you're. I mean, this is more the case, I think, in U.S. prisons, because U.S. prisons are very isolated right now. Like it's very difficult. Like in-person visits are starting to be scrapped and banned, where it's only letters and it's only through a television screen. Like you will visit a prison now in many jails and prisons in the U.S. and you don't actually sit at a table with somebody. You sit before a television screen, and you have to pay money to use the television screen.
Just time for one more, I'm afraid. Esme's chosen someone that, yeah.
I don't think it's on. Do you think that the act of whistleblowing will or has got easier over time?
Thank you. So concise. Do you think that the act of whistleblowing will or has got easier over time?
Well, I mean, it's a different era now. Like now, we're so awash in information. Like this is one of the things that I try to explain to people, because it's no longer an issue of transparency versus secrecy. Now, bad actors just do this stuff openly, and then there's like 5 different versions of events that are being sort of thrown around, and being spread by different parties, right? So now everybody's sort of being like, it's no longer that bad actors in the world are trying to hide what they're doing from plain sight, because they're doing it in plain sight, but they manage to get people to say that that thing is not what you just witnessed or saw, right? And I think that verification of information and the filtering of information is a far greater issue now than secrecy. But it's sort of the same information battle, because we're just so awash in information. I mean, as an analyst in Iraq, in comparison to today, I had access to far more information about what was happening from my laptop computer as a civilian, about what was happening, and being able to make predictions on the Russian invasion of Ukraine than I did have access to as an intelligence analyst in Iraq in 2010. So with all of the U.S. intelligence apparatuses, capabilities, and everything. So that's how information-driven we've become, and how widely spread this stuff is in comparison to today. It's just a totally different information environment. There's just so much more information out there.
I'm going to just from that ask you. You talk about this extraordinary information that they have, that you had into people's lives, this insight you had into people's lives.
Yeah, now we all deal with it every day.
Yeah, so how worrying to us as citizens is that? Just how much information you had then compared to now on what we're doing our everyday life.
Yeah, I mean, I as a civilian today, I can definitely learn a lot more about sort of what's going on in your. I mean, if you're on TikTok, for instance, because TikTok is very good at this, based on swipes alone with your thumb on your screen, how fast you are, down to the microsecond, can determine your age, your sex, your location, what your background is, what your religious orientation is, what your political affiliations are, what your favorite color is. Just based on a few swipes, it learns all of that. So it's not even information that we say or do, but simply our physical movements in the space that we're in can determine an enormous amount about who we are.
I mean, I'm not.
and this is in the private sector. This isn't government stuff. This is just stuff that a company can obtain.
Everyone quickly get rid of TikTok, but it's not just that. I mean, obviously, it's so much else. And unfortunately, I mean, the time has gone by far too quickly, and I've gone over by 6 minutes. But just to say thank you to you, a great audience.
Thank you.
Chelsea, thank you very, very much indeed.
Thank you.